be aware of that. All right, and so for today's Meet the Librarian talk, I'll be introducing sort of copyright basics to you all. We'll be talking about copyright for education specifically, and how it affects sort of your teaching and how you use materials in the classroom. The presentation shouldn't take too long, probably 30 minutes tops, so then there'll be plenty of time for you guys to ask me any questions you may have or any follow-ups. So for those of you that don't know me, my name is CJ, and I am the Liaison and Communications Librarian here at the Arizona campus. I also act as sort of our resident copyright expert here in the library. And so today we'll be talking a little bit about the basics of copyright, what is copyright, what's covered by copyright, how long does it last, that sort of thing. And then we'll move into talking about some of the specific exceptions to copyright that apply to teaching. In particular, we're talking about how those exceptions apply to both in-person and online instruction. And then from there, we'll take kind of a deeper dive into fair use, which is sort of the most important exception for teaching purposes. And then at the end, we'll talk a little bit about public domain and Creative Commons materials and how you can use those in your teaching. So to get started, it's important to understand that copyright actually has its roots in constitutional law. In the text of the Constitution here on the screen, you can see that the basic premise behind copyright is to give authors of works kind of a limited time monopoly on how that work is used and shared, to incentivize people essentially to create things. But at the same time, it was always meant to be limited, so that work could be shared and reused and sort of be used to generate new ideas. And so copyright is based on this premise of sort of balancing the needs of the creator and sort of that exclusive monopoly with the needs of people who will be using that work in the future. And so to be more specific, copyright gives authors the exclusive rights to control how a work is both shared and used. In particular, this means that authors have the exclusive rights to reproduce, distribute, perform, display, and make derivatives from their work. It is important to understand that copyright is automatic. You may have heard about copyright registration. And one of the important things to note is that in modern copyright law since 1978, you actually don't need to register your work to get copyright protection. From the instant your work is set in a tangible medium, essentially meaning the instant something is sort of written down or recorded or anything like that, it is automatically granted copyright protections. That being said, you can still register your works for copyright, and that registration confers additional legal benefits should copyright infringement happen. Typically speaking, copyright lasts for 70 years after the death of the author for any works created after 1978. Before that, it can be a lot more complicated because it depends a lot on the circumstances under which it was created. It depends on whether or not the copyright was registered and whether or not it was renewed. And I've linked here a guide from the Cornell Library that sort of breaks down in a chart how to determine if something is still under copyright based on all these different laws. But of course, if you ever have questions about whether or not something is under copyright, you could always come to the library as well. And if anyone is interested in the slides to get the links in them, just send me an email and I'll be happy to share these out. One of the really important things to know about copyright law, though, is that exceptions to copyright law are baked into the text of the law itself. That's U.S. Code Title 17, which governs copyright. And these exceptions aren't like cheating copyright law. They're not getting around copyright law. It is using copyright law as intended, right? As educators, you are conferred legally with certain rights to use copyrighted materials. And so one of my goals today is to sort of impress upon you that you should be using those rights and that you can't be using those rights. So to quickly sort of go over some of these exceptions, the first is Section 110 of copyright law, which applies to in-person teaching. There are a couple limits to these exceptions. The first being that it only applies to in-person instruction at nonprofit educational institutions. Working at AT Still, you're kind of covered as far as that goes. But the more important limitation is that it only covers the display or performance of copyrighted material for teaching purposes. So it can be really helpful, for example, showing videos in class, using images in PowerPoints, or like reading parts of an article or book out loud. But you'll note that this is fairly limited in the exceptions it provides. Notably, it doesn't cover things like sharing out articles for course readings and things like that. And so that will come with fair use. We'll talk about that more in detail later. But it's important to note that this in-person teaching exception is sort of what enables you to share certain materials in your classroom, such as videos and images particularly. One of the important things to note, though, is that the original text of this law didn't apply to online teaching. It is technically a different law that applies to online teaching, and it has slightly different requirements. So Section 110.2, you might have also heard of it called as the Teach Act, basically takes these same principles and applies it to the online classroom. So the same rules generally applied. You have to be teaching as part of a nonprofit educational institution, and it only applies to display or performance of the work in an online environment. However, there are a couple of extra limitations put on online teaching. The first and most important of which is that the exceptions only apply if you're limiting the display or performance to enrolled students. So what this means is that you kind of need to make sure that any copyrighted materials you're using are only being used in like Canvas or another secure environment, like a Zoom session with a password. If you're putting copyrighted materials up like on a public website or something like that, you could be infringing upon copyright. Another important limitation for online teaching is that it has to be essential to the teaching of the course. So what this means is that you can show a video if it's part of like your main lecture and it's part of the important course content, but you cannot use copyrighted materials under this copyright exception for supplementary materials like additional readings or additional educational materials, stuff like that. One of the things you may have noticed about these sort of two exceptions is that they are very limited, and they don't allow teachers to do a whole lot with copyrighted materials. However, the good news is that these things do not overwrite one of the more fundamental exceptions of copyright law, which is fair use. Fair use is essentially a broad doctrine built into copyright law that allows basically anyone to use copyrighted material if they're using it in what we call sort of a fair way. In essence, fair use asks if you're using copyrighted work in sort of an original or interesting or important way, and if you're using the copyrighted work in a way that is within sort of reasonable limits. So the actual text of the law itself is that it is fair use to use copyrighted work, including making reproductions for purposes such as criticism, comment, news reporting, teaching, scholarship, or research. You'll note also that here in the text of the law that teaching explicitly refers to making multiple copies for classroom use. What this means is that fair use is the principle most often invoked when we're talking about, for example, sharing PDFs of articles with students or making copies of articles to share out as course readings. As sort of one of the exemplars of fair use written into the law, that's a long established practice and is a very strong defense for using copyrighted materials in the classroom in this way. One of the important things to note about fair use, though, is that it is very squishy. That short quote I just showed you on the previous slide is basically all the guidance, for the most part, that the actual text of the law covers. And so it'll be up to you as an individual to always make a determination as to whether or not something is or is not fair use. Just because there are not particularly strict guidelines, there are not hard rules, and it's always sort of a subjective opinion. This is particularly true because ultimately fair use is sort of like a defensive argument. So whether or not a use is fair or not is ultimately only ever determined in the courts by judges. And so what you have to do as an individual is sort of think about sort of existing best practices in fair use, think about the guidelines that are there, and sort of apply those to think, well, does this most likely end up being a fair use? That being said, using fair use in educational purposes is a very long established practice, especially common ones like sharing articles follow existing best practice guidelines that exist. They're part of the exemplar in the law. They have, generally speaking, not really been contested in the courts. And so using materials under fair use for education is a very well-established practice and usually a pretty safe practice, but ultimately is up to you as an individual to make that risk determination. I do see in the chat we have a question. Can you please clarify it is okay to give the students a citation to access supplementary or recommended readings? Yes, so if you give a student a citation, of course, it's up to them to go and find a copy, and so there's no copyright issue there. And one of the things too I would point out is that if it is a material that we have in our library collection, it's always allowable by copyright to simply give students a link to that copy. Because the materials that we buy through library subscriptions are licensed to do that and to be used for educational purposes. And so you can always provide students links to material that we have in the library. And you can always provide them with citations for articles that we don't have in the library, because they could always request them through interlibrary loan, and we could provide those articles to them legally as well. I see another question. If you're using a PDF of a journal article, does it have to be abstract only, or can we provide the whole article? So it depends. If it is an article that we have in the library collection, you can go ahead and give them the full PDF, because like I said, if we've paid for the article, then you can use it for teaching purposes without issue. If it's a PDF you've acquired some other way, that's where fair use kicks in. Like I said, it says, as an example or a fair use, that providing multiple copies of an article for teaching is fair use. And so generally speaking, you can provide full copies of articles to students for teaching purposes without issue. That also adheres to best practice guidelines for copyright and fair use that are sort of put forward by most of the major organizations that work in this space. Like I said earlier, though, if you want to be extra safe, you could always provide a citation instead, and the students can always look for the articles themselves or request it from us via interlibrary loan, and that would work as well. But getting back to the topic of fair use, there are 4 factors sort of determined by the courts and laid out in the law that determine whether or not something is fair use. These 4 factors are the purpose and character of the use, the nature of the copyrighted work itself, the amount of the work used, and the effect of the use upon the market. So to break these down into each one, the purpose and character of the use sort of looks at why are you using a particular work and in what context. In particular, all of the examples laid out earlier from the law are typically favored by fair use, including teaching, education, and research. And so generally speaking, an educational use will always tilt the scales in favor of fair use, but it is important to understand that just because you're using an article for education, it is not automatically fair use, because that's sort of a common misconception. The nature of the copyrighted work takes a look at sort of what the work is that you're using and how creative it is, and therefore how much protection it gets. Things like creative works like paintings, photos, images tend to be a bit more protected by copyright than more factual works like academic articles. That being said, typically speaking, this factor, the nature of the work, is considered to be the least important, and courts often kind of disregard it entirely in their evaluations. The third factor is the amount of the work used. Now, note that there are no hard limits or strict guidelines for this. Sometimes you'll see sort of myths floating around, like, you can only use 10% of an article or 3 chapters. But these guidelines are sort of a bit outdated, and they're not really baked into the law itself. What the actual law of fair use says is that the amount of the work you use should be in relation to the need you have for it. For example, for a course reading, typically you'll want students to read the entire article, so it would be fair use to give them access to the entire article, because in this case, using the entire work matches your educational need. The last factor is the effect of the use upon the market. Essentially, fair use will take a look at the revenue impact of a fair use. So for example, if you're sharing an out of print work or something that's not readily available, it tilts the analysis a bit more in favor of fair use. All right, I see another question. Does the length of time and quantity of students using the article determine fair use versus purchase of the article? So generally speaking, not really. What matters more to the fair use analysis is that you are using it for educational purposes, and that you're using sort of a reasonable amount of the work. And that in the case of articles, they will be less protected because they're more factual. Technically speaking, the more students that are using the article, you can make an argument for greater market harm. And so that particular element might sway against fair use. But in general, if you are sharing articles only for educational purposes, if you're sharing it only with enrolled students, then it makes for a pretty strong fair use defense. All right. And so the next thing I wanted to quickly cover was the public domain. So any work that has sort of expired in its copyright, like I mentioned earlier, that modern copyrights only last until 70 years after the death of the author, enters the public domain. And as you're probably familiar with, anything in the public domain can be freely used without restriction by anybody. And so this is particularly helpful for images, for example. There are a lot of public domain sort of photographs and historical images out on the web, and those could be a good option for if you're needing images for like handouts or PowerPoints and that sort of thing. The other thing that is in the public domain is any work created by the federal government or government employees sort of doing their job, because the federal government cannot place copyright upon materials. And so government websites and sort of federal publications can also be a rich source of public domain material. Here on the slide, I've put two images to sort of indicate whether or not something is public domain. The image on the left is often applied to images that are in the public domain, either because their copyrights have expired or they're made by federal governments or things like that. The image on the right shows that a creator has actually willingly put their material into the public domain before it would naturally expire, as some creators do decide to share their work as widely as possible. And the last thing I wanted to briefly talk about today is Creative Commons licenses. If you've ever seen sort of like open access articles, you might have seen Creative Commons licenses. A lot of images and teaching materials are often licensed under Creative Commons licenses. And so Creative Commons is essentially a legal framework that enables creators to share their work openly, sort of under certain conditions. The sort of default and most essential condition for a Creative Commons license is that people must basically give attribution to the original creator, often in the form of naming the creator and providing a link to the original. And so the most most open and sort of the most basic Creative Commons license is this top one, CC BY, which means that anyone can use it for any purpose as long as they provide attribution. In essence, the attribution for Creative Commons license is pretty similar to citation. And so it's the same basic principle, is that just sort of give credit where credit is due, but you can use the material freely. The thing about Creative Commons licenses, though, is that the curator of the work can apply any of these other three limits in any combination to the license itself to sort of place additional restrictions upon who can use it and in what context it can be used. The first of these is the no derivative works limiter. This means that the work could be reproduced, it could be recreated, it could be shared. It just couldn't be used to make sort of additional materials or new materials based off of that work. It can be adapted into something new, but it can be shared freely. The next limiter is the share-alike limiter. This one is a bit more complicated, but essentially what it means is that anything created using the original material has to be shared under a similar license. This can be very complicated, especially for using sort of different Creative Commons licenses at the same time, or depending on sort of the IP of the work you're working with and stuff like that. And so generally I recommend people just kind of shy away from stuff shared under a share-alike license, just to avoid kind of the legal headache that might arise out of those ones. Luckily, most materials these days are shared under less restrictive licenses. And the last limit, and it's probably the most common one, is non-commercial, which is exactly what it sounds like, which is that anyone can use it for any purpose, provided it is not sort of making profit or anything like that. Obviously, in educational use is typically going to be nonprofit, and so these non-commercial materials can also be very good for educational purposes. All right, and I see some more questions. Is the term student broad or strictly actual students? For instance, would student cover practicing clinicians participating in a journal club webinar? So in this case, I think it's important to remember that Fair Use Act, that the actual text of the Fair Use Law doesn't specifically mention students. It says education, teaching, commentary, and criticism. And so in this example, I think a journal club definitely would fit under that. And so I think that there is still a strong fair use argument for it. I think it is perhaps not quite as strong as a classroom use, but yeah, even with that being said, I do think it makes for a pretty strong fair use argument, because it is still a matter of education. It's also a matter of commentary, and criticism that be taking that work and sort of discussing it among your peers. All right. And so at the end of my presentation here, I do have a couple just resources for you. First is my email, cjgarcia@atsu.edu. If you have any follow-up questions about copyright for teaching or for any other purposes, feel free to shoot me an email. And of course, you can always use the Ask a Librarian form on the library homepage as well. I've also provided a link here to our copyright guide, just goes over some of this in more depth and in more detail if you want to refer to that later on. So do you have any more questions for me? All right. Well, if you don't have any more questions, then I won't keep you longer than I need to. This recording should be shared out with the faculty later on this week. And like I said, if you have any more follow-up questions, feel free to shoot me an email whenever you want. Same thing as well. If you would like to get access to the slides I prepared here, go ahead and send me an email, and I'd be happy to send those along to you as well. Have a good day, everyone.